right? Like the artist gave you a clue. The artist said, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
And, this is what the blockchain is philosophically. And, in that email, there's a whole bunch of other things about entities. They have properties, natural, metaphysical, and so on. And so the challenge was like, could we take that initial impulse by the artist,
Hmm.
almost like something they kind of channeled, and say, okay, that's our clue. Let's go hunting in the forest, the dark, the forest of the blockchain, and see if we can't find that thing. We have a treasure map. Is it there? And we can
Hmm.
always like build it ourselves, but that's much different than finding it. And I think we found it. And the way we found it was, or the way that it's encapsulated now is in a library called occult math. And so when the Ethereum blockchain launched, they did not have the coding language is very kind of primitive, and they
Hmm.
didn't have certain functions to test against like overflows and all these kind of things that happen in mathematics when you're not careful. So there was
Hmm.
a library that everybody always used called safe math, and now that's been
Yep.
incorporated into the compiler. But so we had to basically subvert that. We had to subvert safe math and use unsafe math, which was our occult math. And the main operation, the one that basically manifests an entity, one of those
Hmm.
8x8 matrices, is inspired by two operations. One is the Fourier transform, which is basically lies at the heart of all signal processing. It's over 100 years old. This is an old mathematical idea that all modern computers rely upon, and even radios, any kind of signal processing. And basically, what Fourier figured out was that any signal, whether it's repeating like the ones that we see here, periodic, or it's totally stochastic, like the vibrations coming out of my mouth right now that don't ever
Hmm.
repeat. You can take any of those signals and you can break it down. So if that signal is the kind of squiggly square like gray wave on the far right of this diagram, you can take that original signal and break it down into a bunch of an infinite series actually, of smooth sinusoidal waves that if you just tweak each one in terms of the amplitude, the power of the wave, and the frequency, how kind of long the wavelength is, if you add them all together, you can get any shaped wave. Um, and what that did, basically, if you can decompose something very complex into a linear array of things that just get added
Hmm.
together to add it, then you can do really, really you can basically you can deal with really, really complex things in very simple ways. And that's exactly how occult math works. You take
Hmm.
a complex thing like the universe or reality, and you do very, very, very simple operations to it. And so the Fourier transform is already a form of kind of occult mathematics, I think. Um, and it's used in basically everything. I mean, here's an example from image processing where you can, image filters, like if you're using Photoshop, when you do a different kinds of filters, like you change the color or you blur an image or you get the hard edges, you're basically using a Fourier transform to do that. You're carving out some of the information. You allow some information to pass through and you cut out others. And that allows you to create new things. It allows you to make art. Um,
Presumably, the Fourier transfer. Here I'm sort of like making a sort of a maybe a small leap of logic. That's how effectively a telephone works, presumably, in that it would break down, what is, as you say, like non-periodic, random sound waves, like the ones that they're using to speak, and break them down into their components so that they can be transmitted through something that just does like the sinusoidal regular waves and then reconstruct it at the other end, I assume.
um, you would have to do that with a digital phone, like a cell phone.
Right.
um, in terms of like the old, like Alexander Graham Bell's phone,
Yeah.
I don't think you do that. It's an
Okay.
analog system, right? But basically,
Okay.
what Fourier allows you to do is to take the physical analog world in all of its complexity,
Mm-hmm.
with all of the mutability of physical matter, and parse it down into an infinite but nonetheless countable
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, like series of elements that are its composite parts. And then you can play with those elements. You can get rid of some of them. You can keep a whole bunch of them. You can multiply them by 2. You can add them together. You can do very simple operations. And then when
Mm-hmm.
you add them all back together, you'll have manipulated the original. And so
Okay.
a telephone at the base level does that if it has to change medium. So if you're going from the physical world through a digital signal into ones and zeros, then you have to use a Fourier transform, and then it'll come back out on the other side as a kind of, a sound wave. But I think old phones actually didn't do that. And so that is the difference between digital and analog. And in a way that means, in theme with everything we're saying here, that makes the digital kind of inherently kind of an occult operation, because it becomes a map of reality.
Yeah.
The other thing that we were kind of inspired by in the main operation is gematria. So in sacred scripture, like the Hebrew Bible, there is an idea that, this is literally the words of God, whoever your God or gods are, is or are. And if so, then, there's probably more than meets the eye. Just like a loot bag, there's probably more to a katana sword than just the letters K, A, T, and so on. And so gematria is an idea that allows you to transform letters into numbers. And once you've transformed those letters into numbers, you can then look for mathematical patterns in texts. A group that this project was almost accidentally very inspired by is the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, which was a group of cyber goth philosophers working at a university in England in the 90s and early 2000s. And they came up with, well, first of all, the concept I mentioned earlier about Bitcoin being a hyperstition, that was an idea of theirs. Another is this idea of the alphanumeric gematria, which is itself an example of a hyperstition. So they came up with a character called August Barrow, who was a 19th century Kabbalist, kind of magician of sorts, that, as far as I know, didn't actually physically exist. But by giving this entity, this person, August, credit for a number of inventions, they've actually become a kind of figure of history. And one of their inventions was called the Anglosic Kabbalah, which was based on another invention, which was the alphanumeric gematria. And it's very simple. Alphanumeric gematria takes the numbers from 0 to 9, and they get the values from 0 to 9. And then A becomes the 10th value, and B becomes the 11th, and then all the way up to Z becomes the 35th. And so you get from 0 to 9 and A to Z, you get 35 different unique kind of values that, in reading any text, you can then transform all the values in that text, whether they're alpha or numeric, into a number, and then do different operations on it. And so we basically looked at those two things and said, how would you smash together? Actually, no. Retrospectively, what we did was we smashed together alphanumeric gematria and the Fourier transform. The way we did it was we basically had a dream, and the idea came to us. And so, as we looked at earlier, this is kind of how you would decode base 64 on-chain art in this example, a loot bag, where you take the base 64 payload, you decode it. That'll give you the metadata plus an image, which itself is again encoded in base 64. And then you decode that base 64 to get a human readable digital file, like an SVG file that can be rendered in a browser. So if we kind of unwind that and just go back to the raw data, the raw 64-bit encoded data that only a computer can understand, the way that we create an entity, what we realized, this was a realization, is that the entity matrix that the artist sent along originally was an 8x8 matrix, and therefore has 64 cells, 64 values. Well, the reason it's called base 64 is because you take a whole bunch of characters, a whole bunch of numbers, characters, whatever, data, and you recode it into just 64 different characters. And those characters are the letters A to Z, capital, and then A to Z, small case, and then 0 to 9, and then a plus and a forward slash at the end. And that makes up 64 different characters. That's the cipher. And so we took that 64 character cipher and we arranged it into an 8x8 matrix that we call the gematrix or gematrix. And the way that you create a matrix is you basically look into the wallet of the holder of the entity at any one moment in time. So whenever somebody calls token URI, whenever they want to render the entity, with a loot bag, when you call token URI, you always get the same thing, no matter what, no matter where you are, who you are, what moment in time it is, how much is in your wallet, whatever, you always get the same thing. You always get a katana sword or whatever.
And to be clear, with the loot bag, like, it's not like the base 64 string is stored in the contract or on the blockchain. What's stored is a formula that when you give it a certain parameter, maybe like the token ID or something, it will perform math and then render uh, an SVG. But it's not. But if you gave it a set, say token 34 instead of 21, it would render something different. But again, it's not stored. It's a deterministic formula or code snippet. Is that roughly right?
That's exactly right. And I think this is probably the best diagram for it. So if you think of everything on the far left is an NFT an on-chain base 64 encoded NFT that you have in your wallet at the time. And if you or anybody else wants to render to see the entity that you also hold in your wallet, they'll call the token URI function on the entity contract. And that function, which is the thing in the middle here, represented by this black box, that function runs a mathematical operation. That mathematical operation, as you said, never changes. It's always the same operation, but it runs that operation, but the input to it depends on what else is in your wallet. So if you happen to hold a loot bag and that's the only other NFT or the only other on-chain NFT in your wallet, it'll basically ingest that loot NFT and it'll spit out a custom matrix based on it. Now, if you held a loot bag and a noun project, a noun NFT and a Pythagorean mask and an ornament and Uniswap V3 NFT, which itself is constantly changing based on your LP position, it'll take all of those, all 4, 5, 6, whatever, 100 of them, run them through the same function, and then spit out a matrix, an 8x8 matrix, based on the inputs.
So the problem that I see you have it labeled there as a black box problem. So basically you're walking us through what was the discovery process for coming up with a function that would ingest these NFTs and then convert them into one of the entities that had some of the properties that the artist had envisioned.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the part of the creative process that Tolkien would have called subcreation. It wasn't like I or you or they or she or somebody else had an idea. It was almost like an idea was sort of coursing through our collaboration with the artist that like started to take shape. And, now I'm recounting it. So it's very, kind of clear. But it was sort of like we had an inkling that this was a kind of gematria-like operation. We wanted to go from text to number. And then one of the realizations, one of the ideas that kind of came through was that, well, if you look at this base 64, instead of, taking the SVG on the far right here, we could have gone and like inspected it and said, hey, give me quarterstaff of skill, the Q, the U, the A, the R, and then I'm going to run gematria on that. Cool. It just so happens that loot has 8 rows of text and we have 8 rows in our matrix. So we could convert, quarterstaff of skill into 8 different numbers and make that a matrix. The problem there is, what if we want to ingest an NFT that's a completely different shape? It's not an SVG, or it doesn't have 8 rows or whatever.
Or it's not loot, right?
It's not loot. So what we came up with was, instead of parsing out the base 64 into the artwork, a representation of the artwork, let's keep it in its occulted form and its esoteric form and its base 64 encoded cipher. And let's do an operation where we can map that onto a base 64 gematria matrix, the gematrix. And the way it works is, basically you start by counting all the capital letter A's. So where you see the green dots is where all the A's were. You count all of them. In this case, there's 4. And then you put a 4 in the top left because that's where the A occupies the gematrix. Then you count all the B's. In this case, there's 33, and you put a 33 next to the 4. You count all the C's, that gives you 15, and so on. And you basically go through every single letter and number. And because there's only 64 possibilities, when we lay them out as an 8x8 matrix, you get a representation of the artwork. But now it's been transposed into a different domain. You've moved it out of the spatial visual frozen domain of a fixed image, and you've moved it into a frequency domain, a time-based domain. And that's how we get that's how we basically ingest base 64 images into these matrices.
Yeah. Okay, so now you have described how one of these entities, I believe that the term that you use in a contract is manifested, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so now, okay, and it's manifested in a way where if I have a noun and maybe a Uniswap position, and maybe I don't know, an end project or something like that, um, that is that renders a particular matrix. But then if I move one of those tokens out of the wallet, or if one of those tokens for some reason changes, right, then um, the entity itself will change.
Yeah. So the way to think about it, I think, is the way I think about it is the entity itself, the 64 numbers in the 8x8 matrix, is a representation of a kind of slice of the entity. So you have to think of, I think of the entity as being much more than what's represented. You're getting a kind of shadow of it. And this is, again, a kind of magical kind of phenomenon. When you evoke something, it's not like, so-and-so like shows up in your magic circle, and you can count the hairs in their beard or something like that. It's a blur. It's a kind of feeling. It's a sense, and some of it is somewhat visual. And it's, and the same, a different person might conjure the exact same thing at a totally different moment in time in a totally different place, and it'll show up looking different. But there's something common about it, and that's why I find magic so interesting. Is that these kind of spells, these conjurations, the names of different entities and so on, they persist across millennia. You find them scrawled on cave walls, caves that weren't even occupied by humans. So like other hominid species had contact with them. And so in a similar way, these entities have kind of things that persist, like their name, but then they are also mercurial. They shift and they glimmer and they change. And the way that they change, one of the ways is by the holder of the entity adding or subtracting other base 64 artworks from their wallet. So a kind of representation of that, this should say Daemonica universe. A representation of that is, if you think of, if the first kind of dimension of the Daemonica universe, say the first kind of NFT that we recognize and are able to digest is, say, loot, then you could, if we recognize loot and also the end project, then all of a sudden you've got a two-dimensional universe. And so your entities become two-dimensional, or potentially two-dimensional. It could be a three-dimensional universe, 4, 10, and so on, all the way up to 256 in our code. So you can have a 256-dimensional universe, and if the holder of an entity is themselves holding all, one representative of each of those 256 dimensions, then their entity would be rendered effectively in full. You'll get the full representation of that. You'll get the 3-dimensional, 5-dimensional, 256-dimensional entity. But if they hold anything less than that, you get a different version. You get a different slice of their entity. And the way that works is, if this is the kind of base 64 encoding, if you happen to be holding 3 different, say, registered dimensions, tokens of registered dimensions of the Daemonica universe in your wallet, then we basically take the first base 64 and we count all the A's and the B's and the C's. Then we do the same thing with the second base 64 and the third base 64 and everyone else, and they just add up and they roll over at 88. So the numbers go from 0 to 88 in all of the entities. But the more you hold, the more you're going to transform your entity. And so it becomes a kind of superposition, in a way, of all the different dimensions. And at different moments in time, the same token ID, the same entity with the same name will have different, different dimensionality and therefore a different matrix.
And so each cell in that matrix, the maximum value of it would be 88, and then it's kind of like an odometer, right? Where if there are more frequencies to count, it'll then switch back to 0.
That's right.
So one thing I hadn't realized was that these things have a static, so even entities have a static component, and that's the name, and the name itself doesn't change. Where does the name come from, or how is that constructed?
Yeah. So the name is basically a kind of pseudo, it's very similar to the way loot works. So it's pseudo random. It's based on the token ID. And that token ID, so if you're ID number one, there's a simple function that basically says token ID number one is going to give me 4 index numbers. So it could be 7, 55, 11, 22. And those index numbers correspond to different sacred syllables from this list of n-grams that were developed with the artist. And then the name is the result of concatenating those together. And then also, again, pseudo-randomly inserting basic punctuation. So these are the first 88 names, the first the first token ID, 0 through 87. And you can see that, like the second one here, Tua Asla Nick, it's pronounceable. These are human syllables.
Yeah.
And as a result, the names become like mantras. You could literally sit there and say Tua Asla Nick over and over and over. And if you did, you would literally fall into a trance. And by magical praxis, not only would you fall into a trance, but you'd be much more likely to conjure or have communion with some kind of entity called Tua Aslanek.
So it's almost like a very, very much like a living entity, right? Like whether it's an animal or a human, where obviously these entities are dynamic, but by and large, except I guess maybe except for us anons, right? By and large, the name remains the same, as this entity goes through its life cycle.
Yes, that's right.
Great. So sorry to derail you there. We're now looking. So okay, we've got this entity with the and so I understand how the frequency of the count changes as you move things in and out. Also, you've got to pre-approve, right? Or there's like an approval function for whether or not. So say if I held Uniswap LP position, but Uniswap hasn't been added to the Daemonica universe, then it's not going to impact my entity. Is that correct?
That's right. And one aspect of that is, and I think it might be written on the slide here somewhere. Maybe it's not. Those dimensions, when we launch the project, there'll be a small handful of dimensions that we will define up front. So we're effectively saying to those existing communities that your token holders have the ability to first of all mint an entity, which the artist has defined as using the term animo, which basically means to ensoul. So you can give an entity, a kind of latent entity, a soul, but only if you're already a kind of holder of one of those dimensions. But then, other communities may say, hey, we love this project. We want our community to be able to be wizards and magicians and sorcerers as well. And so they can pay a 1 ether fee to register their dimension, at which point, an entity they can both, holders of their token can both mint an entity or animo an entity and soul an entity, and the entity will recognize that token in their wallet forever. So anybody else, so if you add a dimension, anybody who might be holding a token from that dimension and an entity, their entity will get updated automatically, because now the universe has become n+1 dimensional.
Right.
Yeah.
And to be clear, it's not just loot NFTs that can be added to that, right? It can be any NFT that is base 64 encoded, and the contract, that's what it checks for, just base 64 encoded. It could be Uniswap, could be anything that's base 64 encoded.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, so now we've got these entities, and I guess the way that I perceive that, it's sort of like, there is this energy that's being, I guess, expressed to a certain extent by the transactions that we do every day with our wallets, right? So we end up expressing, as individuals or as human beings, sort of our fears, our dreams, our hopes, end up being, okay, we're going to move this token here, I'm going to build this or whatever. And that energy then is what's getting reflected in the entity, by the movement of these, by capturing the movement of these tokens.
Yeah.
And so what happens So, okay, we've got this thing that's got like maybe like a little bit of a pulse. Take us through like what happens from there? Like
Yeah.
what can you do with that?
So we're like an hour and a half in, and now we're getting we're just getting message.
Yeah. It
Um,
must be really late for you as well. So thanks for taking the time to walk us through
no,
this.
you're all time zone scrambled. It's midday for me. Um,
Oh, of course. Yeah, that's right. I forgot.
okay, so the other half of the project. So there's entities are so there's a ERC 721 contract. This is the podcast for like hardcore crypto people, right? So I'll
Yeah,
use acronyms.
yeah,
So there's an
sure.
ERC 721 contract for entities that uses a library called occult math and a bunch of other helper libraries and so on to manifest these things and create them. But then there's another 721 contract, another NFT in the Daemonica universe that was described by, developed by, designed by, channeled by the artist. And those are called zentities, like entity with an X.
Mhm.
And you can see here on the screen in the red text that this is a quote from the artist of basically I wrote him or her or they an email one night and was like, hey, encoding these entities now, and like I'm realizing, can you remind me what they are? And the artist wrote back this first thought. This was just like a quick 5 minute later email response. First thought is that the simplest definition of it is that it's a function. Zentity equals X, where X of entity equals entity caret. And basically, like, the interesting thing about this, so I think this is a case in point of this artist sort of like having their sort of like finger on something that they seem to kind of that flows out of them almost effortlessly,
Mhm.
but ends up, when you treat it like a cipher, when you treat it like it's, not to not to kind of mix metaphors here, but almost like a
Mhm.
message from God, right? In
Mhm.
the way that you would with the sacred text and gematria and so on. That's how I've been reading the artist emails, was like, this is sacred. It's the words of the artist, and it's my job to implement it and figure out what it means.
Yeah.
And so this, X of entity equals entity caret. Well, that caret, that little character on the bottom right there, that
Mhm.
little if I was writing you a text message and I use caret, you would probably interpret it as something raised to the power of something else, like an exponent, like 2 to the power of 4 or something like that. It's usually how we use it. But
Mhm.
in certain programming languages, and in particular Solidity, the Ethereum kind of programming language, that little caret is used in this case to represent something different. It represents you can see it here where it says pragma solidity caret 0.8.6.
Yeah.
What it represents is basically you take a numerical value, and the caret tells you that what the caret operator does is it says, take that numerical value and return to me a whole range of values between that current value and some other bound, right? So like between that and like the next logical kind of bound or realm.
Mhm.
And so that's how we interpreted what the artist said, this X of entity, the function that you apply to an entity that creates a zentity. That's how we interpreted it. And so this is what that meant for us, was
Mhm.
you take out that 8 by 8 64 cell matrix that makes up an entity, and you lay it out in a line from left to right. You would have a whole bunch of numbers, 64 numbers, and each one of those would correspond to the frequency of different characters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that's why you have on the bottom here in red, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to plus and forward slash. And so if you think of the entity almost like a landscape, where each value, the number of A's, the number of B's, the number of C's is like the height. And in this case, think of it as a kind of two-dimensional landscape. The red here represents that. So you might have 18 A's and 24 B's and 24 C's and 21 D's and 25 E's and so on. And you get this undulating landscape. So the zentity then, by that caret operator, would basically be everything that fills in above that, all the way up to the
Mhm.
number 88, which is where, where the odometer, as you put it, rolls over. And so
Mhm.
this is how we create a zentity. A zentity itself is like an entity. It's a matrix of numbers, an 8 by 8 matrix of numbers. But those numbers are basically a mirror image or a cast, like a mold, like the way a sculptor would
Mhm.
make a plaster